Thank you very much, Hubertus, for this great introduction. Now, allow me to introduce the other two panelists. First of all, I would like to introduce Dr. Andreas Dombret, who is a member of the executive board of the Deutsche Bundesbank, the central bank of Germany. May I ask you to join me here on stage? He studied economics, business administration. Also, Mr. Felix Hufeld. Mr. Dombret studied economics and business administration. But the thing that most people don't know about him, he's also American, and they let him be in the regulator. He's also the first ever person who is a regulator, who is on the central bank, who comes from the private sector, and he's very interested in art. Mr. Hufeld is president of the Federal Financial Supervisory Authority, BaFin. He is the thing that one doesn't know about him, he likes music, and somebody told me he plays the cello. So that's very good.
So I hope it's true.
Yes. So here we go, and both gentlemen have a great sense of humor. I found out, and they may need it with this moderator. Now, first of all, I would like to ask. We've seen from this excellent speech of Mr. Kaspersky how much at risk we are. And just think of the first line of defense. Think of electricity, because if you don't have electricity, you also don't have water. That's what most people don't realize. So stack up on your water supplies in your homes. So he's absolutely right. And if you look at the multiplication, the financial. The Financial Conduct Authority of the UK had 15 registered attacks in 2014, or 5 registered attacks in 2014. By 2016, the first 9 months, they had several hundred attacks. So that's how it multiplies. It's exponential. But on that happy note, let me ask you, you've just had a lovely lunch, so let me give you a little bit of work as the public here. Let me tell you, how likely do you think that, with a show of hands, do you think it's likely that within the next 5 years, your institution could be prone to a cyber attack? BaFin not?
Oh, yeah.
Already hacked.
Every day.
No. That's the second question. The second question is, how likely do you think you can get systems in place so you will be able to be safe against an attack? Considerably fewer people, but I see we have some optimists, and you're an optimist, so that's good too.
That's our sense of humor.
Absolutely. This is very good. So, given these questions, let me ask first, Mr. Hufeld. Everybody seems to think it's very likely that there could be an attack. How do you deal with this problem from a regulatory perspective?
Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed for having me here. It's a pleasure to be back. Lutz, thank you very much. It's a great conference you're doing here. And also thank you for bringing cyber security issues to the fore. It's absolutely key. Andreas and myself are sitting in a body which is called the National Council on Financial Stability, where we keep discussing overall threats to financial stability in this country, and cybersecurity has constantly moved up the ladder in that space. So to be concerned about that both on a micro-prudential level vis-à-vis individual banks, as well as on a systemic level, is a growing challenge for all of us. So what are we doing? We start actually, like most of our peers in the international community, in the international regulatory community, with setting up standards, processes, risk management processes. Logically speaking, from a from an individual bank's point of view, managing cybersecurity is one component of what you could consider operational risk. Logically speaking, it's an application of risk management procedures, strategies, governance structures, and what have you, of course, applied to a uniquely new challenge with all the parameters and new challenges going along with that. We are just in the process of finalizing a set of rules called BAIT, Bankaufsichtliche Anforderungen an die IT, which comprises sort of a whole set of such requirements. Now, that is in itself a pretty major step forward because prevention is a very key component of the whole effort in that regard. We can't stop there, though. So the next wave lying ahead of us, assuming all the requirements spelled out by BAIT are sort of well implemented, will be looking at the effectiveness of such measures. So how good they really are to do their job next to just the formal requirements from a procedural point of view. So that is all about impact assessment, how well are we actually doing once a real threat is there. And the third wave, which is sort of happening in parallel in a way, is how to cope with challenges or with damages, with incidents, once they are there. That is not as well developed as the first piece. So I think in such a sequential fashion, we try from a regulatory point of view to as much as we can, with the toolbox we have as regulators, to approach the issue. And by the same token, of course, we ourselves, as a regulator, have to learn a lot about the whole matter. It's new. And like the speech given by Mr. Kaspersky, we learned a lot from our colleagues of the BSI, the Bundesamt für die Sicherheit in der Informationstechnologie, which is sort of the technical hub and center of competence dealing with those so-called critical infrastructures in this country. And it's not good for your health to go to their crisis management room for too often, because then you see all the nasty things happening in real time, which Mr. Kaspersky was talking about. So it's reality. It's not a potential threat, it's reality every day.
Allow me to just quickly follow up with two sub-questions, which is how much bite has bait? In other words, you have these rules. Are people being penalized when how do you enforce the rules? So how much bite has bait? And on the second one, are you of assistance if somebody really has an incident? Where does BaFin come in?
Well, first question, we enforce risk management requirements like all other requirements. If we find out that a particular bank does not meet the requirements formulated by the regulator, our colleagues from Bundesbank and BaFin will find out. And then we will simply instruct them to do so. That's not unique to any other gap, in a way, between risk management requirements and such requirements. A totally different question, though, is how bitey they are in actually doing the job they intend to be doing. That's a different kind of question. That remains to be seen. It's a learning curve. I mean, we can only see how to adapt, how to refine such requirements. And your second question was?
Well, once an institution has sadly been hacked into, is there anything, do you have any mechanisms to support them, or are you saying, guys, you're now on your own?
Technically, no, because we are not an authority having the technical know-how. That would be the BSI and other authorities. But to the extent there are certain regulatory efforts, we could support, but not comprehensively. That's just a small part of it. That's why well-designed prevention is so important, and well-designed emergency plans, business continuity plans, are so important. Because, I mean, just think about it. Let's just assume for a moment you could fix a crisis in, say, 76 hours. Maybe distrust of the whole system grows so rapidly within 12 hours, 24 hours, 36 hours, that once you have solved it technically, you're sort of dead meat before you have fixed it, technically speaking. So, and that clearly is something where, to be honest, we are just at the beginning of a very massive learning curve altogether.
Dr. Dombret, as the regulator, as the Bundesbank, how worried are you? How much are you two working together? How worried are you about these attacks? How do they figure in your sort of scale of things that keep you up at night?
First of all, also thank you for having Felix and myself on this panel. We speak all the time. I think we have 2 more telcos scheduled for today. So it's good to see Felix in person. He's really around. Bonn and Frankfurt can be very far apart. Now, everything what Felix said is of course right, but the 72 hours he was mentioning, I wish that in most cases one would find it within 72 hours, because as we all know, it takes even much longer. I've seen statistics, maybe I shouldn't call it statistics, I've seen data that on average it takes 156 days until financial institutions discover that they have been intruded, and in 2/3 of the cases they don't even notice themselves, but they notice through customers, supervisors, the police, other parties, third parties, rather than noticing, which really, makes it very dangerous. And Felix is right. You want to fend this off within 72 hours, but in many, many cases, you are not able to do so. And if you don't fend it off in 48 or 72 hours, your chances of preventing this is getting slimmer and slimmer, and with technology getting better and better, it will become worse. Now, we do have in the German banking system, of course, quite a number of legacy IT systems, as you would imagine. And so the German banking system is no different from other banking systems. And I also don't need to mention that neither the BaFin or the Bundesbank really are concerned as supervisors about the technical level of IT, security, nor do we advise the banks we supervise about technical levels of IT. I also would like to mention that the main goal is not the absolute prevention of attacks. That would be a totally unrealistic goal to have, that the regulators or supervisors would now be charged with absolutely preventing attacks from happening. But because this is unrealistic, but it's our goal, our task to make sure that banks manage their IT risks and the cyber risks at large and in a reasonable, consistent way across all banks in Germany. That's a more realistic issue. So I am concerned what's going on. It is a major risk. I also am concerned about the spillover effects from other sectors. Healthcare was mentioned, transportation was mentioned, all other infrastructures, stock exchanges. You can have all sorts of other sectors which would then, even if the systems of the banks would be fine, could be negatively affected. So there is a lot of room to be concerned and to act. But don't expect supervisors or regulators to be able to prevent attacks from happening. That is not something anybody can reasonably promise.
I just have a quick follow-up question to something that I found rather scary when you said, well, 72 hours we hope they find out, but sometimes it takes as much as 150 something days. Does that mean that banks can actually be robbed blind before they find out?
The smaller the amounts you steal, the longer it will take to find out. If you start rounding the third or fourth digit, you can steal much more than if you try to rob the entire bank. Then you find out very quickly. But I'm not an expert in these things, don't get me wrong. I never rob banks, and I am not a programmer of technology, but at least that's what the logic tells me. Now, there is technology out there, maybe the gentleman who did the keynote can confirm or he cannot, where intruders, whom, by the way, you can hire in the darknet, and depending on how much you want to pay, you can have a more sophisticated or less sophisticated attack. So you cannot only get a gun in the darknet, but you can also get IT intruders in the. I also haven't tried this out, but it's in my briefing. So depending on what kind of attack you have, there are technologies out there that intruders intrude a banking system, and when they extract from the banking system, they dissolve the traces of their intrusion. I find it. You can confirm that. So this has just been confirmed. So this.
Well, I have to say, I don't do internet banking, and after this, I don't even try to start doing internet banking. I still talk to my friendly banker.
But then you are back to the 18th century. Yeah?
Absolutely, I'm back to the 18th century. I'm perfectly comfortable there. Thank you. Now you both obviously need to have a certain level of staff that is familiar with these issues. How difficult, how easy is it for a regulator to attract qualified staff? I've just read recently that the Bundeswehr, the German army, have started to have a cyber unit, and because they found it hard to hire people, they said, okay, these people will have very high ranks, they will be given their own apartments, and they don't have to, they don't have drills early in the morning. I'm thinking, I'm not qualified, of applying because I always need to get up around 3:30, so that seems like a very cushy lifestyle. Now, Mr. Hufeld, how difficult is it for you to hire? Is it the money that you need? Is it the lifestyle? What do you need to give them to feed the beast, so to say?
Well, so far, we did well. We don't hire such people in masses. We need, for our task, we have to perform a certain amount of people, which then have to be a blend of understanding the subject matter at hand, as well as the regulatory affairs wrapped around it in a way. And that's why it's so important that we do cooperate with other authorities like the BSI, which I mentioned before. They need experts in the hundreds, maybe someday in the thousands, I don't know, but currently they have to hire enormous amounts of people. And indeed, I know from the president of that authority, that's a key challenge. I do agree with that. For us, so far, knock on wood, we could get the kind of people we needed, because in our case, and I suppose that's not so dissimilar to Bundesbank, it's a very unique blend of financial know-how, legal know-how, regulatory know-how, and of course, you have to understand the subject matter, as I said before. But we don't need 300 IT programming experts. That's not what we do. There we have to rely on other authorities. So cooperation of center of competences for various aspects of the challenge is absolutely key.
And I guess they're not cheap. And I think you have your own experience, and I can imagine that if you have all of this knowledge, if you know about banking, you know about cybersecurity, you know about programming, I guess you command your price, don't you?
Now, I'm looking at this from two perspectives. Firstly, needless to say, the Bundesbank is a bank itself with some infrastructure, how should I say, infrastructure parts. We are the largest supplier of payment systems, of course, in Germany. So we could be hacked ourselves in our banking function supporting the German banking system. So we don't really want to be hacked, but we have lots of attacks. On the other hand, I'm looking at it through the glasses and the eyes of a supervisor. And what we are least looking at is at the IT equipment and whether this is fit or whether this is outdated or whatever. We look at the risk assessment of the banks. Now, how are they assessing the risks? What is the organizational structure in banks? With that I mean, do the banks have accountability structures in place that you know at every single time who is responsible and in charge. And we look at things like incident response plans, but we don't really look very much at the IT equipment. Again, we do not advise on or against certain equipment. We think about this, as Felix said in his opening remarks, we think of it as an operational risk measure rather than of a technical measure.
But how is it for you to find the people that you need to get all of these measures in place for yourself, you know, to communicate to the banks?
We also don't have drills in the morning.
Okay.
If that
But
helps.
if I may add one component to that, where we can't help in looking at more technical matters as well, that's the obvious trend. Well, it's more than a trend, the obvious reality of outsourcing strategies.
Yes.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, banks, like everybody else, have to outsource all sorts of services to other service providers, and that's sort of a first-level outsourcing. There may be second-level outsourcing activities from the first level going to whatever, server providers, cloud management providers. And if you don't know what's happening in the outsourcing side of things, you may end up with accumulation of risk with very few providers on sort of the back end of that chain without even understanding the types of risk happening there. That doesn't mean to say outsourcing is a bad thing per se. Of course not. It has to happen. But it does provide a sort of a new element of risk we have to look at. That's not entirely solved by today. You know, of course, we do expect a bank outsourcing stuff to somebody else that they can make sure that the risk management provisions we ask them to observe are still in a way deliverable. But you know, if the chain of outsourcing goes on and goes on, that can become quite tricky in real life. So that's something both Bundesbank and BaFin have to work on to make sure that's well observed.
That's of course very correct, and if I may add, also the authorization procedures, something BaFin has just published on. So when you open an account, how do you authorize yourself technically, also is another one where we would look more into the IT equipment side of things. So there are, of course, some of them, but generally we're looking at it from a risk management point of view.
Excellent. Now I have the last sort of question before I have a sort of a one-line question for you. And it goes first to Dr. Dombret, which is, you know, cyberspace is, as we have seen, it's not confined to national borders. Now, regulators are sort of regulating for national purposes. To what extent does the Bundesbank work with its EU peers and the ECB when it comes to cybersecurity? Are there best practices? When you see what your peers do, if you see that they're doing something extremely well, are you taking that over?
Yes, we do. Of course, you know, if the presentation we heard before we started here on the panel did show something, especially on the first slides, then that this space is a very dynamic space. So if you don't learn from each other and if you don't keep up with these developments, you're already lost before you started. So we talk a lot within the ECB, also within the EU, which is again bigger than only the Eurozone. As a
in the US, do you talk
very much, and I also know everything about the Bangladesh case, being a central banker.
Oh, that's very good. That's very
which
good.
I'm not going to share with you, but I can tell you I know more than I want to know about it. And I think in your very short presentation on the case, I didn't find a mistake. So it was a rather simple attack with big damage.
My guys were there.
In which capacity? In which capacity?
Now, how about you? Do you look at your because these attacks? It doesn't stop at the border, especially when you supervise the international banks. Do you sort of take into account the vulnerabilities they have from abroad?
Well, of course, absolutely. Let me just go one step further. From a regulatory point of view, many of the things we are actually implementing has been initiated and developed on a global scale. I mean, the Financial Stability Board, the FSB, is sort of the ultimate owner of all sorts of issues we are working on a global level, and coping with cyber risk type of issues is one of them. So the kind of BAIT requirements I mentioned earlier is actually based on the so-called fundamentals, which had been developed right there. So it is very well understood, both on a regulatory level as well as an operational supervisory level, that this is not at all a national matter. It does hit the ground somewhere, but the way how we do it is by definition an international challenge.
That's very good. And now I have just one question before I'm opening it up to the floor. I have one quick question for you, which is, if you can answer that in one sentence, please. What do you expect as regulators from the people you're looking after, from the financial sector institutions, to do to make sure they're optimally prepared and keep themselves secure?
If we all agree that cyber risks are here to stay, the financial institutions we supervise should treat these risks with the same deliberation and the same wholeheartedness, so to say, as all the traditional banking risks.
Okay, and for you, Mr. Hufeld?
My message would be, make it a top priority of your risk management, make it a permanent challenge, it's not a one-shot deal, and make sure you know how to cope with it once something bad happened.
Brilliant. So now we have actually time for a few questions. And I'm putting on I got these glasses to scare panelists into keeping to 2 minutes. I'm putting on my intimidating glasses, which should be welcoming you, in this time is now welcoming you. Yes, sir, would you please ask your question?
Jochen Biedermann, Frankfurt Main Finance. Like we see in the overall financial industry, the fintech startups, there are also a lot of small startups in cybersecurity, besides the big players like Kaspersky Labs. Do you see a sense, a function in them providing new cybersecurity prevention solution for banks?
Mr. Hufeld?
Well, sure. I mean, everybody who can contribute to improving cybersecurity is highly welcome. But those choices predominantly need to be made by the banking industry itself. As Andreas said a moment ago, we as regulators and supervisors provide for risk management requirements, and banks/bank industries or conglomerates have to think through. But not to kid ourselves, I mean, fintechs, as much as they can provide new services, can provide from the risk itself, themselves. It's sort of a two-edged sword. It goes both ways.
There's a market out there, and that's what we want. We want not only demand, but also supply.
Oh, brilliant. So you see, careful, they're on your heels. They're on your heels here. Mr. Kaspersky, do we have other questions? Yes, sir.
Cameron Brown, Ernst & Young. Do you think that banks, financial institutions should be held to a different standard of cyber hygiene than other industries?
Yes.
Mr. Hufeld?
Well, I think that's more of a philosophical question. You know, we are financial supervisors. We try to hold the industry which is entrusted to our supervision, we try to hold them to appropriate standards. Whether or not that are, functionally speaking, equivalent standards to electricity or health or transportation, I simply don't know. So I think we are, Andreas and I think would be quite happy people if we think that the standards developed for the financial services is appropriate and is appropriately followed through and does its job.
Mr. Hufeld?
Now, this is such a big issue, but when we define our standards, we don't compare with other sectors. We try to have the right standards for the right challenges, and that's what we need to do. We're not going to say, you know, in a different sector, standards are comparable. So we are looking to have the right standards at the right time. And what you need to do is you need to balance the thrive for innovation with when and how you regulate. If you regulate far too early, you're going to kill innovation. If you regulate too late, you're going to have potentially all sorts of unintended consequences. And this in a moving, forward-looking technology is not that easy. So what I'm trying to say is standards should be high, but we also need to make sure that innovation, positive innovation, of course, not in cybercrime, comes through.
Yeah, but following up on that, there are industries that are incredibly important for you. Electricity, no payment systems.
Yeah, that's a different question.
So are you working with, via the various institutions within the country? Are you working with them to say, okay, look, we as the people who supervise the banking sector need X, Y, Z in terms of electricity and transportation, for instance, to work?
Sure. But that's a different question. That's not the question about equivalence of standards across sectors. That's a question of what kind of spillover effects coming from other sectors, like no electricity, you made that point a moment ago, could have spillover effects on financial services. And of course, the answer is that would be a real problem. I remember, Andreas, a couple of years ago, when we were thinking through about pandemic effects on financial services, on what kind of emergency plans do you, Bank ABC, have to potentially cope with spillover effects from such pandemic. That is sort of, logically speaking, a comparable situation. So as part of our cybersecurity requirements, we have not yet done stuff like that, but I wouldn't be surprised if we would, sometimes down the road, ask questions like that. How would you, Bank XYZ, be prepared in case you had sort of a 24 hours blackout situation or something like that? Big banks, I know, do have BCM plans for that, but indeed, but that's a different question. That has nothing to do with same standards for different sectors.
Dr. Dombret?
No, the only, why don't you drop the doctor? That makes only sentences. If you compare sectors, there is one interesting data, which is that if you look at what kind of insurance premia are paid by which sector to prevent against cyber attacks, you see that in the last years, the financial sector has been taken out the most insurance capacity against this sort of threat. And I remember there's a reason why that is, I think. And if you remember the old John Wayne movies, when there was a robbing of a, was heißt Kutsche?
Coach.
Yeah, whatever. Coach, Wells Fargo coach, not the bank, yeah, the coach. And people say, why did you rob the bank and why did you rob the coach? And John said, that's where the money is. And that's why banks take out more insurance against, and central banks, because there's also some money over there. That's why there is more insurance being taken out by this sector. But that doesn't mean that Felix or myself or any other of our colleagues would be looking at it, comparing to other sectors what kind of insurance they would take or what kind of precautionary measures they would take. We try to have our standards. One of the standards, for example, is that there is a certain minimum amount of mileage you need to have between your IT system, your IT center, and your backup. To give you one example, just to be sure that if there would be Felix mentioned the pandemic attack, whatever, that you would have enough space between your backup system and your main central system, just to make sure that the backup potentially could start working and is not hit by the same, and so on and so on. So that's what we are questioning in all our supervisory on-site inspections all the time. Now, the German banking sector has seen a number recently of an increased number of on-site inspections with IT technology and cyber risk, cybercrime focuses in the last 1 or 2 years. And there's a reason to that.
Did you have a last question? Because you were...
It's not a question, I was going to just...
Okay, well, you can do that during the panel. So what I would suggest, in the interest of, I know it's very important to Mr. Fett that we are punctual, and I'm not only British, I'm also Swiss, so I have an inbuilt clock. In the interest of my Swiss heritage and Mr. Fett's interest, I would like to summarize just 2 or 3 points that I have heard as a little gift to you. We have the National Council for Financial Stability and cyber the priority of the whole cyberspace and cybersecurity has risen quite sharply there. You look both at, when you look at the people you regulate as cyber, trying to immunize against cyber risk as something, as an operational risk, a process. So you look at contingency plans. You don't necessarily look at just what software, but how are you prepared in case something has to happen. It's a dynamic field, so one needs to look globally, and you are looking globally. Again, like with the International Financial Stability Board, looks globally, and it looks more and more at these things as well. So we need to, when you look at what you want from the institutions, it's you want them to give top priority to cyber risks, and you want them to think deliberately on what could be at risk, and you also then look at how for your institutions how they will deal with things such as other parts of the economic sphere that is influenced, like electricity blackouts. And so you expect them to have really good contingency plans, and you obviously, what you see is what encourages you also is, but they must be aware, because the insurance premia went up, and they're all really putting a lot of money into insuring themselves against cyber attacks. So it must be at the forefront of their and of yours as Deutsche Bundesbank thoughts. So with that, allow me to thank those 2 excellent panelists who have managed to make a rather dry topic really interesting and with a lot of sense of humor. Thank you for your sense of humor.
My pleasure.
And insights.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Danke.